The House of Rising Winds by Frank Belknap Long. Jimmy Marlowe sat on a stump in the wild wood, sobbing and digging his knuckles into his eyes. The thing that had happened to him was horrible. He was old enough to realize what murder meant and how close he had come to being the victim of a murderer. When Jimmy shut his eyes tight, he was back in the cellar again. He could smell the dampness of the earth mold, the vinegar tartness of the cider vats. He could see the old carpets stacked against the coal bin, tightly rolled and swarming with silverfish. And he could see the dim, shadowy trunk looming out of the darkness overhead and just the cuffs of his uncle's trousers. Then came a hoarse grunt and the trunk descending, careening down the cellar stairs straight toward him. Jimmy had moved in time. Just in time he had leapt back, screaming, and the trunk had struck the stone floor with a terrible splintering crash. But how could he go back to the house now? His Uncle Jack was a determined man. He was not a convicted criminal, but a man free to plot and scheme. He would try again. He would keep on trying until Jimmy died, and owls hooted in the empty silence around the big dark house. His Uncle Jack and his Aunt Katy, whispering, conspiring together, waiting to seize the first suitable opportunity to get rid of Jimmy and have a satisfactory explanation for the police. He could see their parchment faces, their darkly brooding eyes, fastened upon him in sly reproach. "Why did you run away, Jimmy? Why, Jimmy lad? We only wanted to kill you." Jimmy shuddered and opened his eyes wide. Sunlight slanted down through the aisles of the forest, bathing the woodland vista in a golden haze. A tiny hummingbird, iridescent as a dragonfly, was hovering above a wide-petaled flower so close to Jimmy he could have reached out and grasped it. Ants were busy at the base of the stump, and a katydid was trilling from a bough overhead. Katydid, katydid, katydid. Jimmy knew that Katy did want to kill him, but Jimmy didn't want to die. His Aunt Catherine had tried slyly by leaving the gas jet on all night in his bedroom. He'd stayed awake and turned it off, his right eye unlidded like the wary orb of an infant cyclops. But the next time, Jimmy was smarter than Katy. Jimmy was smart enough to realize what an inheritance meant. Although Jimmy was an orphan, he knew more about mean, withered people than most boys of 8. He was a bright, alert little boy, by no means a prodigy, but guileless and loving, therefore quick to sense malice in adults, even greed. The old dark house would belong to Jimmy when he came of age, if he ever did. The house and a very large sum of money. Money meant nothing to Jimmy, and he hated the house as much as Uncle Jack loved it. But how could he give up his inheritance? He couldn't just say, "I'll give it up," and forget about it. Uncle Jack was no dope. Uncle Jack trusted no one, and grown-ups were funny about giving away money. What if Jimmy grew up and changed his mind? "Here's your supper, Jimmy," Uncle Jack would say, and in the soup or the eggs, boiled hard the way Jimmy liked them, would be arsenic. Aunt Katy read detective stories. She read them aloud to Uncle Jack, and Jimmy had crept to the door and listened. Arsenic. Jimmy knew what that was and what it could do. It was a kind of medicine, but when you swallowed it, you didn't get well, you died. Jimmy turned pale when he thought about it. He'd have to run away. He'd have to, but who would take him in and hide him? If he was caught and brought back, he wouldn't live long enough to get another chance. "Jimmy, you've had your chance. Now it's our turn." Jimmy was starting to get down from the stump when a voice said, "I wouldn't advise you to run away, Jimmy. 2 can play at that game." Startled, Jimmy looked up. The figure standing before him was that of a very tall, pale young man, his body fitted into the strangest suit that Jimmy had ever seen. It wasn't really a suit at all, but it looked a little like one of Uncle Jack's oilskin slickers, long and wet and glistening. Pale green the slicker was, and it covered the young man up completely from his ankles to his chin. "Don't be alarmed, Jimmy," the young man said. "I know all about you. I know just how frightened and miserable you are." He smiled. "You need a friend, Jimmy, and you've got one." Jimmy gasped and blinked furiously. The young man had a very wide forehead, and his skin was so pale that Jimmy could almost see the bones of his cheeks shining through. His hair wasn't brown or black, but gooseberry green, and when the sun shone on it, it flashed with all the colors of the rainbow like a dew-drenched spiderweb. His eyes were strange, too. They blinked unceasingly and kept changing, just like the eyes of a cat. The young man should have frightened Jimmy, but Jimmy wasn't in the least bit scared. He wanted merely to swallow hard on a mixture of amazement and relief and a sudden overwhelming joy at having found a friend. He'd never dare to hurt you, Jimmy, if he knew I was here, the young man said. He's a cruel man and a cowardly man. Your aunt is more of an old vulture, though, and she dominates him. A nastier pair of human harpies I've never had the good fortune to meet. Who are you? Jimmy gulped. That can wait, Jimmy, the youth said. My world is not ugly and holds little that is evil, but we know what suffering is. Tell me something, Jimmy. Do you like zoos? Strange animals and plants with odd habits, winged and fanged like the beasts that trespass on your dreams when you've eaten something that disagrees with you. You know what I mean, Jimmy. It's like the fear of old houses and not being able to run fast enough. It's so dreadful that when you wake, you're still frightened. It's so good to wake up, safe and alive. But if the beasts were in cages, Jimmy, and you could look in at them and feel perfectly safe, wouldn't you like that? Jimmy must have nodded, for he suddenly realized that the young man had turned and was moving swiftly away through the forest. He seemed to know that Jimmy would follow him, and Jimmy did. They had passed through heavy underbrush, and Jimmy soon found himself lagging behind and struggling with leaf-hidden snares that plucked and tore at his flesh. Not only clinging vines, chestnut burrs, and big purple thistles. At first, the young man seemed unaware that Jimmy was having trouble, but the instant he heard Jimmy cry out, he stopped short and laughed. His laughter rang out merrily in the wild wood. Jimmy, I forgot. You can't pass through foliage. If you'll have a little patience, I'll burn a path for you. Jimmy saw the youth's hand go under his slicker and come out with something slender and shining that looked quite a bit like one of the test tubes in Jimmy's chemistry set. Jimmy shuddered to spite himself. His uncle had given him the set on his 8th birthday without warning him that some of the chemicals were not meant to be played with. Luckily, Jimmy had survived the explosion with nothing more serious than a scorched hand. You poor child, Aunt Katy had whispered, pouring oil on his hand and wrapping it in sterile gauze. Sometimes I think your uncle is a bigger fool than he pretends to be. The house might have gone up in flames, and your aunt burned to death in a terrible manner, the young man said, pointing the tube at the heavy tangle of underbrush directly in front of Jimmy. No wonder the malicious old vixen was upset. She wanted your inheritance for herself alone. As the young man studied the tube, he looked straight at Jimmy and smiled. Watch, Jimmy, I'm going to clear a path for you. From the tube there shot a blinding shaft of light. The underbrush shriveled as the light pierced it, shriveled and coiled up like a burning Chinese dragon made of silk. What made you think of dragons, Jimmy? The young man asked, his strange eyes shining in the glare. Jimmy hadn't said a word. He had simply remembered the parade and the accident with the dragon bursting into flames. His uncle had taken him to Chinatown to watch a parade, and someone, not his uncle, had dropped a lighted cigarette on the dragon from a window high above the street. You were only 6, but that parade must have made a profound impression on you, the youth said. Now, whenever you see something burning, you think of dragons. Isn't that so? Jimmy was too startled to nod. He was watching the burning underbrush roll away in a cloud of smoke, his jaw hanging open. Quite a lot of little flames left, eh, Jimmy? Guess we'll have to step up the beam a little. The tube seemed to twist in the young man's clasp. From it there shot a shaft of pale blue light. As Jimmy stared in slack-jawed amazement, all the smoke vanished, and the flames dwindled and went out. The remaining foliage wasn't even charred. Now keep close to me, Jimmy, the young man warned. This part of the forest isn't quite stable. I had to float the cages in, and it took a lot of doing. Ever try floating a raft on a marsh that's covered with less than 6 inches of water? No, I never did, Jimmy choked. Well, you have to change the trees a bit and make sure the angles don't melt and run together. It's difficult when you're just starting to get the feel of a forest like this. If it blurs when you're using the tube, you've got a problem on your hands. He laughed. You don't know what I'm talking about, do you, Jimmy? It sounds crazy, Jimmy blurted. You're not crazy, are you? No, Jimmy, but to be honest with you, I've often been drawn to people who are. They're close to us and very like us. They're out of touch with ugliness and look out through bright windows at a world that was never meant to be. Things start off wrong sometimes and stay that way. It's nobody's fault, but if you get to brooding about it, well... Jimmy looked frightened. I'm not... No, Jimmy, the sanity of childhood can't be shaken. You don't need to look out through bright windows. You are a bright window. Jimmy's fright diminished a little. He didn't quite see how he could be a window, but it wasn't a terrifying thought, even if it changed things he had always taken for granted. He was sure that grown-ups who were crazy didn't talk like... What did you say your name was? Jimmy gulped. I didn't say, but you may call me Lacula. That's a funny name for a man. I'm not exactly human, Jimmy, but you wouldn't understand that either. I came from very far off in a roundabout way. The universe doesn't just stretch away forever, Jimmy. It's like a house with an attic cellar, where you can meet yourself coming back. You can open a door and find you've just closed it, or climb the stairs and be outside in a garden full of bright flowers that somebody planted in another time, another world. But you have to know how to move around in the great house of the universe. You have to be very old, or very wise. It takes a lot of doing, Jimmy. It's as though you were looking down through a peephole in a tree stump, looking straight down at the sky. You'd see all the stars, but upside down and far away. And that's as far as I can take you, Jimmy. You'd have to fall through that peephole to see me as I really am. Now I've taken on call it a protective coloration. You know how a chameleon changes, Jimmy. There are forces here that have shaped you, made you what you are. When I floated the cages in, the same forces changed me. I look almost human to you, but I'm not at all. Not really. It's just skin deep, Jimmy. I'm just stopping over here. You know how trout fishermen stop at trailer camps, just for a day or two, to cast their flies on deep bowls and hope for a sizable catch. They wear old jackets and battered hats, and you'd never think they were solemn as owls, and gray and tidy in their big homes when winter closes in, freezing the foaming waters and their summer youth. According to our lights, we all like to hunt and fish, Jimmy. You never know what you're going to catch. The universe is so big, there's always something newly strange in the whirlpools beneath gray rocks in little green worlds where the great grappling hooks have never gone, where the huntsman must tread softly and fisherman ply his rod with care. Lacula nodded. Even now, Jimmy, I'm standing on a higher bank than you are, but you wouldn't understand about the cones and the prisms, how they rushed together when I floated the cages in and brought me to your side of the stream. Lacula was right. Jimmy didn't understand. In fact, when he opened his mouth to ask another question, he found there were no words for what he wanted to know. But Jimmy's mouth stayed open. They had emerged into a clearing walled with sycamores and white-barked birch trees, and Jimmy was looking at something so strange that the foliage at his back seemed suddenly darkened and terrifying and full of whispering shadows. In the center of the clearing stood a great iron-barred cage, hemmed in by long grass and little mounds of fresh earth and the tracks of forest animals. When Jimmy stared intently, he could see right through the cage, could see the long grass and the forest becoming wild again on the other side. But that didn't change what he saw when he looked into the cage without straining to see beyond it. When he looked directly into the cage, he saw only a tumbled waste of sand which stretched away to ice-capped mountain peaks shimmering in a purple haze. Only the width of the cage separated Jimmy from the long grass in back of the mountains, but in order to pluck a blade of that grass, he would have to cross the desert on foot, trudging on warily for hours. Jimmy had no desire to pass between the bars and set foot in that trackless waste of sand. The beast was impossible, a nightmare, yet Jimmy knew that it was real. It was foraging just inside the bars, an enormous loose-jointed thing with soot black eyes and a long tapering snout which it kept half buried in the sand. The beast had the snout of an anteater, but it was covered with down like a new hatched chicken. It was fanning itself with a tail of blood-red plumes that grew straight out of its hind parts, and was almost as big as the spread tail of a peacock. It was a tail such as Jimmy had never thought to see on a beast, and it was matched in strangeness only by the long, diamond-bright claws which slowly unsheathed themselves as Jimmy stared. The beast raised one claw as Jimmy stared and scratched itself. Its dark eyes fastened on him as though it would have much preferred to be scratching his eyes out and sinking its teeth into his throat while it wrapped its snout about him in swiftly tightening loops. Biting and tearing and ripping at his flesh, raking his back as he struggled, and bearing him to the earth. Not yet. Jimmy's breath was a wheeze in his throat. He was cowering back in horror, but he was still unharmed. He was still a safe distance from the cage, and he had no intention of moving closer and giving the beast a chance to turn ugly. "Nothing to be afraid of, Jimmy," Lacula whispered. "It's a dangerous brute, but it can't get at you. Remember, Jimmy, when you were 6, and your uncle took you to the snake house at the zoo. He told you how deadly a cobra was, hoping to frighten you. But the big, rearing snake, swaying back and forth an inch from the glass, fascinated you, gave you a thrill. Just knowing it couldn't get at you was fun." Jimmy was trying hard not to look at the cage, but it would have been an accident of an unusual kind if he had failed to notice the big square sign at the bottom of the cage. The sign was bright, like isinglass, and it glistened in the sunlight. The writing was funny, like on the boxes of cigarettes his uncle smoked, imported Turkish tobacco, and then a lot of half-moons and broken-off zigzags. Lacula laughed at Jimmy's perplexity. "Like Arabic, hey, Jimmy? It isn't really, but it's not English either. Suppose we turn it into English." Lacula raised the tube as he spoke and let the light shine out over the sign. The writing changed into letters. "All right, Jimmy, I'm sure you can read it now." Jimmy read the sign. "Inhabitant of Mars. This is a peculiarly vicious specimen and must not be tellesated by the immature. Not all Martians are vicious, but the harmless varieties are much less interesting from a melt-flesh's point of view. Specimen captured and caged by Lacula in his 3rd expedition to the solar system." Jimmy couldn't spell out the hard words, but he knew what a specimen was. When you chased butterflies and caught one, when Jimmy became very thoughtful and quiet, he was a little ahead of his years. He had read a book about butterfly collecting, and a book called Astronomy for Young People. Mars was a planet in the sky, not a star, and there were 7 other planets. Venus was the brightest one. "Yes, Jimmy, Venus is as bright as a star when you look at it on a clear night," Lacula said. "But what you really see is the sunlight reflected back. Suppose we take a look at a Venusian." Jimmy wanted to scream when he saw it. The cage stood at the edge of the clearing in bright sunlight, but there were deep, dark shadows behind it, and it was filled with swirling mist. When Jimmy stared past the bars, he could see 5 other cages filled with moving shadows, each rocking a little as if buffeted by the wind that was blowing, keenly chill, up Jimmy's spine. He tried hard to look at the other cages, but his eyes kept coming back to the hideous beast in front of him. The beast wasn't moving at all, just watching him. The beast had gill slits down both sides of its neck and webbed claws and feet, and when the sunlight shone on its big-eyed face, it looked as dead as something hung up to dry in the window of a fish store. All choked up was its face, all mouth and all throat, as if it had spent its entire life gasping for air, breathing harder and never getting enough. "Keep your distance, Jimmy," Lacula warned. "It's a malicious little beast. You see, Venus is a dismal, foggy, horrible world. The air is stagnant and thin, and that creature has lived in a bog from the day it was hatched." Jimmy took an alarmed step backward. Only Lacula's calmness and smiling eyes prevented him from succumbing to utter panic. "It has no natural enemies," Lacula went on, "but it knows how to hate. It would kill you just to get at your inheritance of fresh, clean air." Lacula seemed suddenly to realize that Jimmy was trembling inwardly in horrible fright. He rolled abruptly and gripped Jimmy's shoulder. Now, Jimmy, don't you become frightened. I didn't mean to frighten you. I guess you've seen enough. It's time you were getting back to the big house." Jimmy froze motionless. It was hard to believe that Lacula expected him to go back. He couldn't, wouldn't, not if he had to wrench free and take to his heels. "Don't worry, Jimmy," Lacula spoke softly. "I wouldn't send you back if the danger were very great. You've got to trust me, Jimmy, and believe in me." When Jimmy looked straight at Lacula, a lot of strange thoughts seemed to rush together in his mind. Lacula was like many things at once, things that Jimmy had seen and imagined and dreamed about. A big twisted tree trunk, all knotted and gray with moss, and the lightning forking down, and a little leafhopper jumping about in the forest. And the gold and russet splendor of the autumn woods, and someone playing a piano through shining windows in the dawn, and Jimmy himself lying in the dew-drenched grass, yawning lazily, and stretching his arms while the morning mist rose about him. Lacula was much more than that. Lacula was the sea, wide and boundless, with the great sun shining down, and Jimmy himself running along the sand, stopping to examine the bright shells and pink corals of the sea. Lacula was a treasure chest, green with seaweed, and a pearly nautilus, and the far-off beating of jungle drums. Lacula was a mountain, rising pale and purple at the edge of all the jungles Jimmy had ever dreamed of exploring, and Lacula was an attic filled with cobwebs and old trunks, the dust so thick on the windows that Jimmy couldn't see out. Lacula was a maze of complicated machinery, all whirring and blurring, and Jimmy himself in a greasy mechanic's uniform, his face smeared with grease. Jimmy himself working on Lacula, solving him, taking him apart. Jimmy savoring the joy of tinkering, of understanding the bright wonder of smoothly moving parts, the wonder of pistons, wheels, grease cups, lovely rods and wires, all gleaming, a nest of revolving beauty filled with rainbow colors. But now Lacula was speaking to him and pressing something bright and shining into his hand. "In your world, Jimmy, everything's all mixed up. You have myths and you have science, but you don't realize that what you call a myth is just something true that you found out for yourself without sitting down and racking your brains over it. If you have any kind of a mind, you'll notice things. Even that ugly Martian beast knows more than some of your scientists. It has its own myths and believes in them." Jimmy could feel Lacula's strong hand pressing his fingers together tightly over the shining object. "Hold on to it, Jimmy. I'm going to tell you how to use it. Long ago in your world, a race of wise men had a name for it, the Pipes of Pan. It's really a science, but they guessed. They knew. Now, listen carefully, Jimmy." The sun was low in the sky when Jimmy got back to the big dark house. He opened the front door with a terrible fear in his heart, half expecting to see his uncle standing in the lower hallway with the knotted cord swinging from his wrist. A horrible, vengeful figure like a hangman, prepared to make a sudden murderous attack on Jimmy for daring to run away. Jimmy had forgotten that his uncle was a quiet, even-tempered man who knew how to bide his time. So overwrought, in fact, was Jimmy's imagination that he had built his uncle into a bogey that did the man an injustice. Uncle Jack was the soul of discretion. Always there had been deviousness in his attempts to murder his nephew, a slow, careful approach to his deeds of dark violence which stamped him as an artist in crime. There was deviousness in the house now, a sinister and dreadful deviousness, a whispering behind a door on the second floor which was only slightly ajar. Back and forth in a room upstairs paced Jimmy's uncle, and as still and taut as a spindle from an old-fashioned spinning wheel towered Aunt Kathy, her sallow face wreathed in a crafty smile. A tall, bony woman, and a wrinkle-faced sprite of a man, looking almost kindly in his pacing, his bushy black brows knitted in thoughtful concern. "But what if it doesn't work, Katie? I'm no electrician." "Don't be a fool. It's bound to work, and it will look like an accident. When Jimmy's in the bathtub, I'll simply reach in and push my electric coiling irons off the shelf. I tell you, the current will pass right through him. He'll be electrocuted so fast, he'll never know what struck him."
"I don't like it. It's risky, and it's beastly."
Jimmy's aunt smiled coldly. "Not half as beastly as trying to smash Jimmy's head with the trunk. It'll be quick and merciful."
"But the idea's not new," Jimmy's uncle protested. "The police read whodunits too, Katie. Don't you forget it. That trick's been used in fiction so often."
"Only 4 or 5 times, you white-livered crippen, and not with coiling irons, electric fans, electric heaters. Can't you see the beauty of it? Coiling irons, attached to the house circuit and left on, would carry just as much voltage, enough to kill a child, certainly. And coiling irons are so light and could fall into a bathtub so easily." Jimmy stood up in the bath, with soap in his eyes, fumbling around for a towel. "Jimmy accidentally knocked my coiling irons into the water. I'm getting on in years, and I'm as absent-minded as the proverbial professor. I simply forgot to turn the coiling irons off."
Jimmy's aunt gave her mouse-colored hair a pat.
"How do you like my hairdo? I won't ask the police to admire it, just let them notice it. If we're careful not to overact, they'll have to believe us."
"Are you understudying Constance Kent or Lizzie Borden?"
Jimmy's uncle sneered. "That's not a very flattering thing to say. You have an ugly imagination, and I'll thank you to keep your thoughts to yourself. I could mention a few things that a certain Jack did."
Jimmy's aunt gave Jimmy's uncle a conciliatory poke in the ribs. But Uncle Jack was not appeased. "I still don't like it," he muttered. They continued to argue for a while, and as they bandied about words, their voices rose heatedly. Louder and louder they talked, all unaware that Jimmy had crept up the central staircase and was crouching just outside the door, his eyes wide with horror.
"I've drawn your bath for you, Jimmy,"
Aunt Catherine said a half-hour later. Jimmy had allowed his uncle to find him in the lower hallway, not in the upper. He'd returned downstairs and made a small noise to attract attention, and his uncle came padding down in his carpet slippers, his dark, close-set eyes bright with solicitude. Jimmy's return into the bosom of his family had been tacitly accepted with, "Next time you go bird-nesting, Jimmy, you'd better tell us. When you just run off like that, we think of everything. That quicksand bog on Miles' place could take a youngster down mighty fast. One of these days, I'm going to give Miles a piece of my mind. The least he could do is put up a sign." Drippy words brimming with duplicity, not a word about the trunk crashing down. Jimmy wondered why, if his uncle felt that way, he'd failed to put up signs all over the big dark house. "Be careful. Watch your step, Jimmy. We only want to kill you." Now Jimmy stood facing his aunt in his own small bedroom, pajama-clad and looking a little scared, but trying to pretend that he wasn't at all.
"Aw, gee, do I have to take a bath tonight, Aunt Katie?" "Jimmy, I'm ashamed of you. It's been more than a week. How can you want to go around filthy?"
It was on the tip of Jimmy's tongue to plead a sore throat. He wondered why his aunt hadn't thought of forcing him to take a cold bath and opening all the windows while he slept. He'd heard that there were drugs now which could cure pneumonia quickly. Maybe that was why. Jimmy suddenly realized that he was letting Lacula down. He had no right to try to squirm out of it when he'd promised to be brave.
All right, Aunt Katie."
Up to the age of 6, Jimmy had never enjoyed the privilege of taking a bath in privacy. He'd had to make the best of Aunt Katie's bending over the tub and scrubbing his back with a long-handled brush. Bearing down on the bristles, smiling maliciously, ignoring Jimmy's protests, and scrubbing him harder and harder like an evil old witch. Sometimes Jimmy's back had stayed sore for a week. But Jimmy was a big boy now, and Aunt Katie was the soul of modesty. When Jimmy found himself alone in the bathroom, he noticed with the little shudder inching up his spine that his aunt had left the door ajar. He'd expected that, of course, but it wasn't easy to take. He noticed other things. The coiling irons at the edge of the shelf, directly over the towel rack, and well within reach of a curving arm.
and the little shimmer of heat which danced back and forth above the shelf. Someone had once whispered to Jimmy in a dream that if you can see heat, it means that death is shoeing a horse and getting ready to ride. Jimmy forewent the ritual of the bath. He did not test the water with his hands or toes, or waltz around the bathroom drumming on his chest. He did not feel like Tarzan tonight. His mouth was as dry as death, and he was careful to keep his right hand dry too, dry and tightly clenched as he kicked off his slippers, shrugged off his pajamas, and climbed into the tub. Aunt Katy had drawn Jimmy a piping hot bath. The water was so hot it warmed the sides of the tub, but it didn't warm Jimmy. A biting cold wind seemed to blow through him as he settled down in a tub that might just as well have been filled with ice water. Jimmy waited, his knees drawn up and knocking together. Waiting was an agony. He sat there scarcely daring to breathe, feeling worse than helpless, feeling forever beyond help as the seconds lengthened into minutes, and waiting became intolerable. For an instant, as the wind rose and fell and swirled about Jimmy under the water, he thought he saw a shadow flit across the door, but it was quickly gone, and he noticed nothing more for a full minute. His heart was beating wildly when the shadow returned. Blowing toward him through the water came even colder ripples of dread, of terror, swirling around his spine as he stared. The hand was gaunt, claw-like, but familiar. As it crept around the door, Jimmy shuddered convulsively and flung a glance straight across the bathroom to the medicine chest mirror on the opposite wall. In the misted glass, he could see his aunt's face. She was peering around the door straight at him, not dreaming that he could see her, her teeth bared like the fangs of a she-wolf. The bony hand was reaching out now to grasp the electric coiling irons, not to coil human hair, but to coil Jimmy into a knot of anguish in the water with the great pulsing, awful shock of a tub full of electricity. Jimmy came wholly to life then. Lacula had shown him just how to grasp it and what stops to press. It was like a little flute, a child's toy flute that could be played upon by a wise child instructed by a wisdom that was older than the human race. If they come at you and try to kill you again, Jimmy, blow as hard as you can and don't stop. So Jimmy blew. He raised the flute to his lips and blew upon it just as utter triumph flared in his aunt's hate-convulsed face. A piercing shriek came from beyond the door. It was hardly human, that shriek. It was like the shriek of an animal with its leg caught in a trap, and tugging with all its might to free itself from the trap. As it pierced the door with its torment, the bony hand whipped back. Away from the coiling irons, and straight back against the white, stricken face in the medicine cabinet mirror. There was a sudden, terrible gust of wind blowing outward from Jimmy as Jimmy's aunt slapped herself in the face with her own hard knuckles. Then the door was ripped from its hinges and fell back upon her with a deafening crash. Jimmy blew harder. The water in the tub began to quiver and bubble up about Jimmy, but he kept right on blowing. The wind rose and became a cyclone in the dark hall where the door was now spinning back and forth like a gale-lashed leaf in a forest of giants. Aunt Katy was trying to pick herself up from under the door. Jimmy could see her scrawny neck and sharply arching back, and a strange thought flashed into his mind. She's just like a big snarling cat, and if she had fur, it would rise along her back. Then Jimmy saw his Uncle Jack. His uncle was rushing down the hallway toward the bathroom, his coat blowing up about his head. He was fighting the wind, which was tearing and ripping at him, and his face was a twitching mask of horror. There was something owl-like about Uncle Jack as he struggled with the wind. His hair stood out on both sides of his head in blowing tufts, and his cheeks kept sinking in and puffing out, as though with an evil hooting that he was powerless to control. Suddenly, as Jimmy stared, still blowing fiercely, a floorboard ripped loose directly beneath Aunt Katy. Before she could get to her feet, she was rising on the board and clinging to it. She was screaming, and another floorboard was ripping loose under Uncle Jack. Jimmy blew on the pipe. Down the long hallway, the two floorboards floated like rafts caught in a churning pool of darkness that kept spinning faster and faster. As the floorboards dwindled to spinning motes, Jimmy blew with all his might. A brightness had begun to fill the bathroom. It swirled down from the ceiling and around the tub and the small piping figure in the tub. With it came a slight tremor, as though the ground beneath the house had at last felt the tug of the piping. The tremor increased in violence until it shook the walls of the house. But the house didn't collapse. Though Jimmy continued to blow on the pipe, the tremor subsided as quickly as it had arisen, as though the strange, shrill music had lost its power to move and shake. But just before the house became quiet again, a shrill, stricken cry drifted down to Jimmy as if from something that had been caught and caged in flight high above the house. In another instant, the entire ceiling seemed to roll back, and Jimmy found himself staring straight up at the stars with the pipe still pressed to his lips. Jimmy stopped blowing the small flute-like pipe then. Lacula was leaving the earth. He was floating the cages out by balancing himself on a beam of light and training the tube in his hand on a long procession of cages floating in the night sky. He was facing Jimmy in the middle of the sky, but quite low down, and suddenly his hand went up in a greeting that made Jimmy's heart leap. "Good hunting, Jimmy. I've had good hunting, thanks to you." Jimmy stood up in the tub and waved back. He was still waving when Lacula flashed the light full on one of the cages, a cage so near Jimmy that he could see the light gleaming on the trees of a familiar forest, and every stricken lineament of the two faces which stared out at him from between the bars. The faces were so white, drawn and ravaged by despair, that Jimmy couldn't bear to look at them. He could hardly bear to read the sign at the bottom of the cage. "Inhabitants of Earth. These specimens are peculiarly vicious and must not be tellesated by the immature." Jimmy didn't want Lacula to know how he felt, for he was a little ashamed to feel pity for a malice as cold and merciless as the Black Night of space. He was ashamed because his eyes smarted a little and the smallest of lumps had come into his throat. So Jimmy shut his eyes tight. When he opened them again, he was looking up at the ceiling of the bathroom. Jimmy looked down at his hand and saw that it was empty. Jimmy got out of the tub, shivering a little, and into his pajamas, and went out into the hall. There were gaping holes where the floorboards had been ripped loose, and the bathroom door lay in splinters at his feet. He ran along the hall, shouting, "Uncle Jack! Aunt Katy!" He should have known better, of course. He had seen the faces staring out. But he kept on calling, "Uncle Jack! Aunt Katy! Uncle Jack!" Silence. Not a sound anywhere, except Jimmy's own voice calling out and his footsteps echoing through the big empty house. Silence, as complete as though some terrible unknown god of the outer darkness had sucked all sound back into itself. Silence. Not a sound anywhere, except sweeping over Jimmy, the wisdom that comes from facing reality and taking it firmly by the horns. Jimmy was alone in his own house now, and someday he would marry and have children of his own, in a big, quiet, friendly old house. It was his house to make friendly now, his house, Jimmy's. Somewhere in the bright, unfathomable otherwise, Lacula smiled.